This is a talk by Tom Mussmann. Tom was a former cadet of mine at West Point and showed great promise as a faculty. And lo and behold, he is a faculty now at West Point as a major in the United States Army and loving it, I think. And he's a recent father of a second child with his lovely bride. So he's going to talk about what we do and what we want our modeling to take from their course at West Point. I'm going to leave it up to Tom. You're on.
All right. Thanks so much, Brian, for the kind introduction. Yes, a long time ago, he and I spent a long time chasing tuned mass dampers and exploring how to fit a model to a appropriate second order system. But that was long ago, and now I'm back kind of maybe changing the guard. I think I started teaching at the same time as he retired, or close to. But either way, so we're here to talk about modeling in depth, right? So this is maybe a joke off the Army because we like to call things defense in depth. But I will kind of start by telling my bottom line, right? So the bottom line is that we want to be able to model deeply or have students have a deep understanding of, I would argue, a deep understanding of one model is better than a breadth understanding or a cursory understanding of lots of models. We'll go through kind of a background of what is West Point. We'll do another Armyism of backwards planning, right? Starting at what do we want to see from students as modelers, and then thinking about how do we build a course that fulfills that. We'll connect briefly to Bloom's taxonomy, talk about the traps I've fallen into, and then my new thing I like to call is parallel modeling, and we'll cover that. So here at West Point, I guess maybe the main feature I would say that we focus on is a broad education. So whether if you're a STEM, you have at least 24 semesters worth of core curriculum. You're taking at least 12 semesters of non-math, so philosophy, English, literature, language, those types of things as a STEM major. Or if you're a non-STEM major, you'll be taking 3 semesters math, 3 semesters engineering, 2 semesters of IT, right? So there's a large collection of focusing on a broad education. And when we teach our course on differential equation, we teach it to first-year students. So these are cadets just coming out of Beast Barracks or basic training. And what we're trying to do is set up their academic habits that will help them to build on those habits for the rest of their time there at the academy and the rest of their lives as an academic. One thing I'll note is this is on the bottom left, there's the West Point cadet at the boards. So West Point loves to make small classrooms. So even if you're teaching a 300 or 1,000 person course, they love to not make any classroom bigger than 20 people. And so it allows you in the middle of class to say, all right, everybody, you're done watching me do the work. Time for you to go grab some chalk and start trying to do it yourself. We separately, so I teach in the advanced math program. So we teach differential equations first. So they must have covered calculus in high school. And so we do tend to teach more mathematically inclined students at West Point. So we'll start off kind of with this is West Point's modeling triangle. So many people like to have their own modeling ideas, but one starts off in the real world. They transform the problem by assuming away a lot of real world variability, making some proportionality statement, usually inside the problem, you find some givens and finds, and then transform into a mathematical model. And so we would propose, of course, that this is not just a differential equation tool, but then most of the time in our differential equation course, this would be your traditional differential equations course, kind of learning how to solve them. And then coming back from your math solution, kind of mapping back into the real world and comparing to, well, did I really get a good model? What am I missing? What else do I need to work with? How do I improve? So our kind of culminating event, so this is where backwards planning comes in, right? Our culminating event we call the MA 153 poster day. So we pull out, or we make our students get into groups of 2 or 3. Towards the end of the semester, they get a very open-ended prompt of what would you like to model with differential equations? Of course, we help them with scoping, right? If they're trying to do something too challenging or too simple, we'll help them scope it to appropriately be appropriately challenging. But the main goal is to try and get them to chase things they are interested in and to realize the open-endedness. So it does two things. One, by walking around, as you can see here, right, we've got maybe 10 presentations going on at once, and the students have to go around between the different presentations. They can, one, realize the breadth of differential equations in their modeling, but they also get some time to focus very specifically on their type of presentation or their presentation and their project, and understand all the depth that one might be able to, probably not all the depth, but some of the depth that you can get to with differential equations. So these guys are doing a different dissemination of misinformation is their talk. So it's very focused on like SIR, an SIR type model. But we also have a lot of projectile motions, human versus zombies is a popular topic, dialysis, Lorentz equations and weather, multi-room heating, and lots of different ideas. Everybody seems to have different things they are interested in. And so that's where we get. This is another picture of just a different lecture hall with a different set of students presenting. So I'm going to call this thing that we've reached at the end of our course, maybe for a first semester student, we'll call it peak modeling. So the idea is this is the end point of the semester and what I would like them to be able to get to by the end. So by the end, I'd like them to use real world phenomenon to construct a model from basic physical laws. So kind of in comparison to that would be copying a model from a textbook and just kind of picking a model up from a textbook and executing that. So we force them to get away from, or at least make some modifications from the textbooks. And these bottom two or these next two are kind of the modifications we would expect them to make. So either you make a parameter function, maybe you're doing cooling and now your external temperature is some kind of sine function or something like that. You add a term to account for something, whether it's immigration or water flow into the human body creating urea in the process of dialysis, right? All these kind of things that would make the model a little more interesting or more accurate to real life. So kind of helping them go around that modeling triangle a couple times and account for things. The other things we'll briefly talk about is tuning parameters, although we don't really get to mean squared error. We kind of do the famous eyeball test of does the graph behave about the way you should expect it to. But the student should understand kind of as I adjust this parameter, how does it adjust the model? So what this connects me to, I guess, in the West Point environment, we do a lot of teach the teacher kind of projects. And so I've been introduced several times to this idea of Bloom's taxonomy. And kind of at the peak of his pyramid, he would like to say that we create and produce original work, which I think is what we're asking our students to do, and then kind of evaluate that work. That is kind of appraise, argue, defend, explain why our work has value. So for those who aren't familiar, I'll briefly touch on Bloom's taxonomy with my favorite screwdriver analogy. So the way this works is perhaps in the remember phase, we claim I have a set of tools. Maybe I've got a screwdriver, a hammer, a saw, right? And so remembering is simply grasping the tools. Understanding at that point is when you start differentiating between the tools. I mean, we all know how to do this, but I look at my screwdriver and see that's different from my saw. Apply, I learn kind of the narrow case in which to apply it. So I see screw, I grab screwdriver. And then potentially in analyze, I start thinking about the broader applications of what I have learned, right? I have a flathead screwdriver. Maybe I'm going to try and use it to take a staple out, but maybe also I can use this hammer to take a staple out. I don't know. And evaluate, I can kind of relatively compare the value of my tools. And then ultimately at the end of Bloom's taxonomy, I can think about creating a new tool and building that to help others or myself accomplish the task. So in the differential equation course, how I kind of see this working out is in the remember side of things, we kind of hand them differential equations, whether it's Newton's cooling or sum of forces is mass times acceleration, and then we start understanding like, okay, what does this equation mean? What is this rate of change? And then how do I use some assumptions to build this model? So I would argue in the apply phase of this model, we're kind of sitting at, okay, the textbook usually has several, or whatever we're using tends to have several examples, or maybe we learned them in class, and we kind of grab the same example and we say, aha, you're asking me to cool something, so it must be the Newton's cooling problem. Eventually we get them to solve for a parameter with some data. And then in the evaluate, I think is where we want them to spend more time in terms of looking at their model, saying, this is what I need to do to improve it or to change it to better fit the real world or to better fit my interpretation of what the real world should be or should behave like. And then in the create, we talk about making those types of changes and doing them well. So how do we teach students? So I'm going to kind of make two comparisons. So on the top left is kind of where I want them to be. On the top right slide is kind of a review of how we get there. And so we're going to talk through what I would call a traditional, although maybe some of you would tell me, no, you shouldn't even do that at all. But maybe traditional we'll say is where I used to be. So the traditional during class, I pick an example. I briefly discuss, hey, there's some rabbits in Australia. We learn about population. We pick this population model from the book. We find K from some data, and maybe discuss how many rabbits there will be in 10 years or something like that. And I think that's going to be fairly traditional. But then I think the difference particularly comes in the homework, right? So we see lots of these problems of consider a mixing tank, find some concentration, here's some radioactive decay, here's some a Newton's cooling problem. And we kind of write the problems so that it very nicely connects back to a model that a student could find in the book. And what I've found is that students, when you start asking them these types of questions, they learn to copy rather than to understand. Yes, I did explain to them why population growth is proportional to population, but they kind of just got the differential equation and say, anytime I see population, I'm going to grab this differential equation, I'm going to take this screwdriver and I'm going to screw the screw in. Right, and so the word problems becomes put the parameters in the equation problems instead of am I actually modeling? And then I would say the breadth of modeling is prioritized over depth. I would argue that when we use these types of rapid fire models, we instead of forcing students to dwell on the problem, we get into more kind of application-y type stuff and less modeling. So I'm going to assert that kind of when we do these rapid fire modeling problems, we end up reaching the apply and maybe some analyze type results. And so instead, I'm going to propose kind of the other side of things, which I'm going to call a parallel framework. So in fact, at West Point, we give our students a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper to write whatever they want to going into the test. Just when we do like a midterm or a final exam. And we think it's helpful because it kind of gets students away from the understand and remember and forces them to move further along, right? So they no longer have to, remember Euler's formula. They can just write that down and we can start asking more in-depth questions. And so I think particularly this type idea, the rapid fire keeps us, I guess, further away from that. So the first thing I'd like to do in the lecture is I like using Torricelli's law because it's easy to bring into the classroom, right? One can bring a bucket of water and a nice, that's a picture of a plastic bottle that I've put some inch markings on with my high precision Sharpie marker. And we watch how long it takes to drain. And we can start persuading them that Torricelli's law has something useful to do. But I think the more important part is kind of thinking through what does it look like in this kind of transform or get from the real world to a mathematical model, right? So I think it's better to start with Bernoulli's equation, talk conservation of energy, and actually spend a fair amount of time working through how does one actually arrive at the differential equation and kind of what logic I'm applying to get there. I like to compare the step one to a 3-year-old, right? So I have a almost 3-year-old, and the favorite word is why, right? Why is this so? Why is this so? until ultimately you have to go back to somewhere. But the textbook says so at some point, but trying to get as deep into the why question so that hopefully when they see a different model, they can ask the same why question and get to a better answer. The other analogy I like to call it is a used car salesman. Yes, your model isn't perfect, but you would like to sell the fact that your model is good enough, or pretty good to me hard, right? And so your goal is to be a salesman and tell me why your model is right and why I, as an interpreter, should accept your model before I even start going down the what does the solution look like. Yeah, and I guess the other one that I'll spend on here is when we do some of our teach the teacher thoughts, or we get at West Point, we get new teachers in every year, and we spend a fair amount of effort over the summer teaching new teachers. And I would say one of the biggest things I took away when I was learning was if you don't write it, the students don't write it in their notebook, right? If you don't spend the time writing whatever principle you want communicated to your students on the chalkboard, they're not going to write it down in their notes. And so for that reason, we tend to lean away from slides. But in the same way, if you're not going to spend time helping them understand why your model is true and selling your model to them and showing that it's important by using class time, then they're not going to, they're going to go, oh, well, the teacher just looked it up in the book, I'm just going to look it up in the book. Either way, so then what I do is I ask them to find parameters from data. So this is one of my daughter's bath toys. We fill it up with water and we see how long it takes to drain. And then from that, we can approximate the area of those 3 awkwardly placed drain holes that you can see. So that would be the second thing. And then we start talking about, well, what if we make the area of the water or the diameter of the surface area of the water a function of the height? And then maybe we have some kind of inflow from some hose or something that can create, add something else to the function. And so ultimately what we're trying to do is get them to start creating and start making things in their models. And then I think this is the key difference, is where in the homework process, instead of asking lots of models, we pick one model and we dig deep and we ask them to put more and more and more components into their model and start understanding what it means to kind of reattack the model and keep putting new physical phenomenon or new things that they observe in real life into their model. So again, this would be kind of my idea of modeling in depth and spending a long time, or forcing them to spend a long time thinking about a problem and revisiting it repeatedly. So if I were to compare the frameworks, I would argue on one side we get breadth, but I would argue it's a very breathy breadth because we don't actually, in the traditional framework, we don't get to the full breadth. We kind of know lots of models and know lots of places where one can apply differential equations, but we don't have a breadth of ability to kind of do the modeling. But it does do a good job in this breadth framework. We do a good job understanding the wide applications of ODEs across almost every other course that's out there. At least on the technical side, somewhere in the midst of another course is a differential equation. But on the other side, I think the parallel model, I don't want to say we teach them how to make it from scratch, but we teach them at least how to think through and derive and get to the create level of Bloom's taxonomy and get to maybe peak modeling better when we teach it this way. So I'm going to wax poetic here for a little bit after making that comparison between the parallel and the traditional framework, and think about what is math, right? So in general, what math is, as math teachers, is we map from one math expression to some cleaner or more elegant math expression. So adding fractions, taking derivatives, doing separation of variables or integrating factor or Laplace transform or any such other things. We like to live in this world of mapping math to mapping other math. And that many people don't like doing this. Maybe this isn't true here at Semiote, but probably true in the in the broader math world, that we tend not to like the real world modeling because we say that's chemistry, physics, engineering. The point of math is to find the underlying math principles that undergird all the other applications, and we in the math department teach the math and leave them to the applications. But I'd argue that this process of modeling, how shall I say it, right? So this process of modeling is part of math, right? So how one properly transforms the real world into a math expression is the idea of math, right? So I have an office mate who loves to talk about Plato, and he loves to talk about like the true form as opposed to kind of all the shadows that you play with. And he loves talking about math, and math being this idea of finding true form and true relationship, right? And kind of the undergirding truth behind all the physics and chemistry and things like that, right? And in the same way, just as we, yes.
Tom, you've got about 5 minutes. You're doing fine.
Okay, thank you. And in the same way as in the math sense, we talk about finding the pure form behind, or behind all the physics and chemistry. In the modeling sense, we do the same thing. I think there's almost a duty to our students, and especially at West Point, as we're teaching first-year students how to model and teaching first students how to think, right? That the mathematics both provides the true form of how to do math, as well as the true form of how do you take the real world and express it in math. As a aside, right? So of course there's the XKCD that loves to discuss how mathematicians are the most pure form, as we like to talk about it. What I'd like to point out is that just as students take our math skills, the Laplace transform, the control, the solving differential equations to other classes, so they should also be able to take our modeling skills away from the math class. And then when they see in physics that there's some sort of math, some sort of equation they're arriving at, that they can understand behind that someone did a lot of work to actually do the modeling, and they can start understanding behind every other physics, chemistry, sociology, whatever course they happen to be in, that behind that math is the true model. And so if we teach the model in depth, we hope that they understand more closely what it is to model correctly, and more effectively how to understand the real world around them. So just as kind of to wrap up, right? So we started off talking about what it is to be a good modeler and have a good model. Then we used Bloom's taxonomy as kind of a method to compare a traditional modeling approach to a parallel modeling approach. I spent way longer probably than I should have talking about abstracting this idea of modeling to more math types ideas. And then I guess I'll kind of leave with a thought that modeling is often considered trivial to the more mathematically experienced. Just as the first time you teach linear algebra, after you've done it for a while, it just seems obvious. And I would say that many mathematicians don't understand the difficulty that students have when they first open this idea of what is modeling and how do I take a real world scenario and express it in math. Hopefully I haven't taken more than my last 5 minutes, Brian. No, but that's the end of my thoughts. So thank you for your time and attention.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Are there any questions about how they do things at West Point? Do you want to see a drill for marching, or is there anything that he left out?
Hey, Tom. One quick question. In a traditional course, they would see all the various ways in which differential equations can help not only with temperature, but with flight and with Torricelli's law, all these various things. So by concentrating on just one of them, you dig into that deeply. But is there something you do in order to help the students just see that differential equations are applied to all sorts of various phenomena in life?
Right. So I think a little bit sort of towards the end, I would like kind of the poster session where they get a chance to go walk around and see all the other posters that other people are doing. That's where I would kind of put that there. They clearly don't dig into it, right? You can't understand all of that in a 5-minute presentation, but I think it will at least help them understand how broadly it can be applied.
Hey, Tom, that was a fantastic talk. And everybody else, I'd like to point out that in this case, the messenger is the message. So Tom went through a program that was like this somewhat. And one of the wonderful things about being in academia is we get to see all this positive feedback. So what Tom has done is taken an existing program and carried it that next step forward. So absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to chime in that I helped him more than anybody by doing everything wrong so that he knew exactly what was right. Okay. Any other issues or Joe?
Comment? What a great talk, really. One thing that you might squeeze in here is that going from how to take the real world and express it in math requires going through the process of gaining the domain knowledge, because it's the domain knowledge that gets translated. And what's been coming up, and it came up in the last talk from Carrie, was using diagrams to express the domain knowledge prior to going to the math equations. I think that's a big step that I learned over my experience, is that teaching how to diagram the domain knowledge, and of course we all do that, but there's a lot of formality involved in that too, as in fact Carrie just was pointing out with his diagrams.
One thing I wanted to suggest to the rest of you is West Point is a public institution. Your highway taxes pay for it. And they welcome visitors all the time. Just to go into a classroom, usually a seat is reserved in a classroom for a visitor. It used to be a very formal thing, but it welcomed visitors all the time. You go to the math department and write to someone, and going to see this in action and feeling good. I mean, you can get to see parades, you can get to see history. West Point is filled with history of America, and you can go in the library and see USS Grant's picture on one wall and Robert E. Lee's picture on the other wall. But you can also get that feeling of what Tom is trying to do, and watch the cadets at the boards doing things, and watch Tom walk around and tell Nellie that she needs to go over and talk to Bill because Bill's got troubles, you know. So it's a public place, as is Annapolis, as is the Coast Guard Academy, as is the Air Force Academy in these 4 regions of our country. And I encourage you to go there as a mathematician if you're in the region. Even in the summer, they have programs for teaching the teachers. So take advantage.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Apologies. My question is, why is it important at West Point to teach mathematical modeling to the military?
Right. So I think it's, in my sense, it's a habit of thought, right? So what you're trying to help students understand is when one comes into a problem, often which kind of predicting the future or thinking about how things behave in the future, right? Grabbing this mathematical tool and saying, okay, how am I going to apply it to this situation that I happen to run into? So West Point's officers in general like to get maybe not like to get thrown, but the Army likes to put them in jobs that people haven't done before and be like, we'll figure it out, right? And so that's a lot where West Point's broad math and language arts and every type of curriculum comes from, is trying to build students that can approach very poorly described problems. And I think that's exactly what math modeling is about. And we're kind of putting one more tool in their bag of looking at broad, difficult problems.
Thank you, Tom. I'm really happy to hear that.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom.
Yeah, let me see if I